The question of abolishing the Sabbath often sparks lively discussions in Christian circles. It is frequently asserted that Jesus Christ himself annulled the Sabbath as a day of rest. However, an objective historical analysis suggests otherwise. Before drawing final conclusions, it is essential to examine the facts, thoroughly study primary sources, and analyze the process of religious tradition transformation. In various Christian denominations, it is widely believed that their doctrine represents a direct continuation of the teachings and way of life of the apostles. However, do contemporary church practices truly reflect original Christianity as it was known to Jesus' first followers? Specifically, a crucial question remains: when and by whom was worship on Sunday introduced as a replacement for the Sabbath rest prescribed by the Torah? Historical facts allow us to trace the origins of this tradition. The first official recognition of Sunday as a day off occurred on the 7th of March in the year 321, when Roman Emperor Constantine I issued a corresponding edict. This ruler, who had permitted the free practice of Christianity 8 years prior, declared Sunday a day of rest, replacing the traditional Sabbath observed by Christians. Before Constantine's decree, citizens of the Roman Empire celebrated the Day of the Sun on that day, indicating a possible pagan influence on this transition. Some researchers argue that the reason for this change was the desire to commemorate the resurrection of Christ. However, early New Testament texts contain no direct instructions mandating worship specifically on Sunday. The New Testament does not refer to the first day of the week as the day of resurrection, but simply designates it as the first day of the week. Moreover, nowhere does it state that the Lord's Supper must be observed exclusively on Sunday. In his epistles, First Epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verses 18, 20, 33, and 34, the Apostle Paul does not link this sacrament to any specific day of the week. Even early Christian authors, such as Barnabas and Justin Martyr, viewed Sunday as a secondary occasion for worship, rather than a fundamental theological mandate. After the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 of our era, Christians who fled the city continued to observe the Sabbath. According to the historian Epiphanius, such Christians were called Nazarenes because they adhered to traditional Jewish rituals, including the Sabbath, circumcision, and other Torah commandments. This indicates that until the end of the 1st century, the Jerusalem church continued to honor the Sabbath, and no official transition to Sunday had taken place. However, in the year 135 of our era, after the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Emperor Hadrian destroyed Jerusalem and prohibited Jewish religious practices, including Sabbath observance and circumcision. He repopulated the city with new inhabitants, while Jews, including Jewish Christians, were forbidden to settle there. During this time, a small community of Gentile Christians emerged in Jerusalem, distancing itself from Jewish tradition and introducing Easter celebrations on Sundays. This division between Jewish and Gentile Christians led to further liturgical changes. Those who severed ties with Judaism adopted Sunday as the new day of worship. However, in the early centuries of Christianity, this change was not universally accepted. On the contrary, the Roman Church played a pivotal role in the final transition to Sunday worship. In the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, who lived in Rome, strongly opposed Sabbath observance, declaring it obsolete and alien to Christians. Around the same time, a Saturday fast was introduced in Rome, contradicting the Jewish tradition of joyful Sabbath celebration. This practice was intended not only to express sorrow over Christ's suffering, but also to demonstrate contempt for the Jews and their Sabbath, as Pope Sylvester asserted. Over time, the theological interpretation of the Sabbath evolved. In Western Christian tradition, the Sabbath ceased to be regarded as a day of joy, becoming instead a day of sorrow and fasting, while Sunday was proclaimed a day of jubilation. This contrast solidified the dominance of Sunday within the Christian calendar. During the 4th and 5th centuries, church councils repeatedly issued decrees against Sabbath observance. For instance, the Council of Nicaea, year 325, ruled that Christians should avoid any participation in Jewish customs and traditions. The Council of Antioch, year 345, prohibited celebrating Easter alongside the Jews, threatening excommunication for those who continued to do so. This anti-Jewish stance persisted in subsequent centuries. In the year 538, the Council of Orleans forbade labor on Sundays, but still permitted attending worship on Saturdays. In the year 585, the Council of Macon mandated strict Sunday observance, and in the year 589, the Council of Narbonne imposed a final ban on Sabbath observance. These prohibitions indicate that Sabbath observance remained widespread among Christians. If this tradition had already disappeared, there would have been no need for such persistent prohibitions. Historical facts clearly show that the Sabbath was not abolished by Christ or the apostles. The early church, particularly in Jerusalem, continued to observe the Sabbath in accordance with tradition. However, due to political and theological changes initiated in Rome and Alexandria, Sunday gradually replaced the Sabbath in Christian practice. Thus, the change in the day of worship did not result from theological revelation, but was influenced by political, social, and anti-Jewish trends in the Roman Empire. The question of the Sabbath remains open for every believer, and its study requires careful analysis of Scripture and history. The Catholic Church, as its own sources attest, openly acknowledges that the establishment of Sunday as a day of worship was its initiative. The Catholic Press, Sydney, year 1900, states, "Sunday worship is a Catholic institution, and its observance can only be justified on the basis of the authority of the Catholic Church. There is no single passage in the Holy Scriptures that justifies transferring worship from the last to the first day of the week." The American Catholic Quarterly Review, year 1893, makes an even more categorical statement. Protestantism, rejecting the authority of the Catholic Church, has no. Similar admissions are found in other Catholic sources, confirming that the change of the day of worship resulted from church authority rather than biblical commandment. Preservation of Jewish practices on the outskirts of the empire. Despite pressure from the official church, several Christian groups continued to maintain traditional Jewish elements of faith, particularly in regions beyond the direct influence of Roman Christianity. Among them were the Waldensians, who lived in remote alpine valleys of France and Italy, as well as Celtic Christians in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Eastern churches in Persia, China, and India, as well as African Christian communities in Ethiopia, continued to observe the Sabbath while maintaining other elements of Jewish religious tradition. For example, Ethiopian Christians claim that their church traces its origins to the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 8. For centuries, their communities remained isolated from the Western Church, allowing them to preserve significant Jewish influences. They continued to celebrate the Sabbath alongside Sunday, practiced circumcision, and observed dietary laws distinguishing clean and unclean animals. For over 17 centuries, the Abyssinian Church has observed the Sabbath as a holy day in accordance with the Fourth Commandment, note scholars of African Christianity. One of the most striking examples of a Christian tradition that remained unaffected by Constantine and his reforms was the Church of Persia. This community, referred to by its opponents as Nestorian, traces its origins to one of the first Christian missions, the preaching of the Apostle Thaddeus in the city of Abgar. Historical sources indicate that the Nestorians adhered to several traditions rooted in early Judaic Christianity. For instance, Coleman writes, "They observe the feasts of the Lord and honor the Sabbath, on which they abstain from labor. This day they celebrate in a manner entirely distinct from all others." Furthermore, he notes that the Nestorians offer incense on the Sabbath and on festive days. Similarly, the distinguished theologian Philip Schaff, examining their religious practices, states, "The Nestorians do not eat pork, observe the Sabbath, and reject such Catholic dogmas as auricular confession and purgatory." Equally remarkable is the history of the Church in India. According to tradition, the first Christian communities on the southwest coast of India, Malabar, were founded by the Apostle Thomas himself. When Portuguese explorers reached India in the 17th century, they found more than 100 Christian churches already established there. However, they were surprised to discover that these communities did not adhere to the doctrinal teachings of the Roman Church. This led to religious pressure. In his book, A Report on the Inquisition in Goa, year 1684, Delon describes how the Christians of the Apostle Thomas were accused by inquisitors of having Judaizing tendencies. The grounds for these accusations included Sabbath observance, abstention from eating pork, hares and fish without scales, the preparation of the Passover lamb, and several other practices aligned with Mosaic law. Philip Schaff confirms that observance of the seventh day, the Sabbath, was widespread and deeply rooted among believers of the Eastern Church, as well as among the Christians of the Apostle Thomas in India. The same applies to other Eastern Christian groups that broke away from Rome after the Council of Chalcedon, year 451, including the Abyssinians, Jacobites, Maronites, and Armenians. When all this evidence is gathered, it becomes clear that for nearly a millennium, early Christians maintained their adherence to messianic traditions despite continuous persecution and religious pressure. In remote regions such as Ethiopia, where the influence of the Inquisition and Catholic dominance was weakened, these traditions have survived to this day. The Catholic Church openly declares its key role in changing the day of worship, emphasizing that this transition is solely its own establishment. In the publication, The Catholic Press, Sydney, Australia, August of the year 1900, it states, "Sunday worship is a Catholic institution, and its observance can only be justified based on the authority of the Catholic Church. From the beginning to the end of the Holy Scriptures, there is not a single passage that justifies transferring worship from the last to the first day of the week." This perspective is confirmed by other Catholic sources. For instance, in the American Catholic Quarterly Review, January of the year 1983, John Gilmary Shea writes, "Protestantism, rejecting the authority of the Catholic Church, has no proper basis for its Sunday theory and, logically, should observe the Sabbath as the day of rest." In the year 1903, Priest Brady, in his speech published in Elizabeth N.J. News, emphasizes, "The Bible in no way supports Protestants in observing Sunday. Sunday worship is an institution of the Roman Catholic Church." This position is clearly expressed in later Catholic works. In the book Forbidden Sunday and Feast Day Occupations, page 2, by Vincent J. Kelly, it is stated, "God granted His Catholic Church the authority to designate any day or days it deems necessary for worship. The Church chose Sunday, the first day of the week, and over time added other sacred days." The Catholic Church also asserts its exclusive right to religious authority, as evidenced by the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, 20th of June, year 1894. "We hold upon this earth the place of Almighty God." This statement is reinforced by a publication in the Catholic National, July of the year 1895, which states, "The Pope is not only the representative of Jesus Christ, but also Jesus Christ himself, hidden under the veil of flesh." Protestant communities that adopted Sunday worship, according to Catholic authors, thereby recognized the authority of the Roman Church. In our Sunday Visitor, 5th of February, year 1950, it is noted, "Protestants more willingly accept Sunday than the Sabbath as a day of worship, after the Catholic Church implemented the change. Yet the Protestant mind seems unaware that, by observing Sunday, they acknowledge the authority of the Church's representative, the Pope." This idea is reflected in S.D. Moschna's work, Storia della Domenica, year 1969. Not the creator of the universe from the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, but the Catholic Church can claim the honor of providing humanity with a 7-day cycle of rest. The historical decree, the Most Holy Councils, cited by Philip Labbé and Gabriel Cossar, confirms this assertion. "We affirm that the Holy Apostolic See, the Vatican, and the Roman Pope hold supremacy over the entire world." Thus, the Catholic Church openly acknowledges that it, rather than the Holy Scriptures, established the tradition of Sunday worship. In a doctrinal catechism, Peter Geierman, year 1957, it is explicitly stated, "We observe Sunday instead of the Sabbath because the Catholic Church transferred the sanctity of the Sabbath to Sunday." This idea is summarized in the Catholic Universe Bulletin, 14th of August, year 1942, page 4. The Church replaced Sabbath observance with Sunday worship by the right of divine infallible authority, granted to it by its founder, Jesus Christ. A Protestant who claims that the Bible is the sole guide of faith has no basis for Sunday observance. In this matter, Seventh-day Adventists and Sabbath-keeping Pentecostals are the only consistent Protestants. Historical context of Judaic practices in early Christianity. A fourth argument in favor of preserving the Jewish heritage of the early Church is the continuation of practices not affected by the decrees of Emperor Constantine. Historical evidence indicates that for centuries after Christ, a significant portion of Christian communities continued to observe the Sabbath and other Old Testament commandments. This confirms that the shift in the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday was not the result of apostolic teaching, but rather of political and church-state decisions made later.